Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar in our Adolescent Health Provider Education webinar series. The current webinar that we'll be going over today is the teen brain behavior, problem solving, and decision making. So again, this is the second of a 5-part webinar series on adolescent health topics. The first webinar, Transitioning Youth to Adult Healthcare for Pediatric Providers, Training and Resources. The recording is available, so this slide deck is in the handout section, and so you can go there and click on that, and then that link will take you to the recording as well as the slide deck for the previous webinar. The webinar planning group was Dr. Sarah Parvinian, Dr. Rachel Caskey, who will also be our presenter today, Ms. Kathy Sanabria of the Illinois Chapter American Academy of Pediatrics, and also myself, Olivia, of the Illinois Chapter American Academy of Pediatrics. We'd also like to say thank you to our CME application reviewers, Dr. Judy and Dr. Leichner, and then also our content reviewer, Dr. Karen Judy. Dr. Caskey and myself and the planning group have no financial disclosures. Funding for this webinar is provided in part by the Illinois Department of Public Health through funding from the Adolescent Health Program. The CME accreditation statement. All of our webinars are CME and CE approved. Physicians are eligible to claim 1 AMA PRA Category 1 credit, as well as nurses and nurse practitioners through ISMS. And for CE credit, we were able to obtain CE credit from the Illinois Department of Human Services Division of Developmental Disabilities for the following licensed professionals listed. And again, you can also claim 1 continuing education hour. This webinar is being recorded, and following the webinar, it will be made available at the same website that you will see where the transitions webinar is. There will be a table, and it'll have the recording next to it. If you have additional questions, feel free to contact me. My email is ophillips@illinoisaap.com, or you can give me a call at 312-733-1026, extension 209. If you have additional questions during the webinar presentation, please type them into the chat box, and then we will do our best to get to them at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, at the conclusion of the webinar, attendees will be emailed a link to complete an online evaluation. Once the evaluations are submitted, myself will send the participants a certificate of participation for your CME or CE records, and this will occur around next week. So you will receive an email. If you do not receive an email with a link, please reach out to me, and then I'll make sure that you receive that. Resources for this webinar is from Bright Futures, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the National Institute of Mental Health, and the AAP. So for the learning objectives for the webinar, we're going to understand the basics of adolescent brain development, recognize the implications of new brain research for serving adolescents, develop anticipatory guidance and education for adolescents and their families, expand strategies for providing teens developmentally appropriate medical care, and also respond to unique needs of adolescent moms. And so the AAP does value healthy brain development. So these are some of the resources that were put out by the AAP, and you can actually research these articles and then go further over the healthy brain development. And so now I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Dr. Rachel Caskey, and she'll take you through the rest of the PowerPoint or the presentation.
Thank you, Olivia. 1 second, we will get this up. All right. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all via the web this afternoon. So we're going to spend the next 45, 50 minutes talking about adolescent brain development, which I think is a really interesting topic, not only from a sort of clinical medical standpoint, but also I think from a appreciation of the limitations of our adolescents and young adults in terms of their cognitive and decision-making capacity. So we're going to go through a number of things. And please, as mentioned, type questions into the box if you have them as we go. And hopefully we will have time at the end to get to them. So if we look at overall brain development, so as you all know, adolescence is this time between childhood and adulthood. There's really no universal agreement on what ages it begins and when it ends. Most feel it starts somewhere around 11, 12, and then ends somewhere in the early to mid-20s. It's certainly a period of extensive developmental change, hormone change, physical changes, and so forth. Little was known about brain development during adolescence until really the 1960s and 70s. And a lot of the initial work was done through post-mortem brain analysis, as unfortunate as that is. More recently, we have much more advanced technology with functional MRI, which we'll get to. But a lot of our early understanding was really from autopsies of post-mortem adolescent brains. And so if we're looking at the current picture shown, you can see the change in the parts of maturity of the brain over time. So the more blue and purple the brain is, the more fully mature that brain is. And so we know the frontal cortex, which includes the prefrontal cortex, is the area of the brain that controls reasoning and thinking before you act. So really impulse control and thoughtful actions. And this area of the teen brain is still very much under development throughout adolescence. And this really makes sense, right? This explains why many of our adolescents and even young adults struggle with impulse control or struggle to really think through consequences of actions before proceeding with the action. And what I find so striking is the preteen brain here looks closer to a 5-year-old than it does a 20-year-old. And so I think that's really important as we think about the limitations of our early teens. They really are more like children than they are adults in terms of the prefrontal cortex, even though they may not physically look that way. The forming of myelin increases the speed in which information travels through the brain, as you can see there. There are two main changes that occur in the brain during adolescence. The first involves the speed in which information travels. So as neurons in the brain develop during adolescence, a layer of myelin forms around the axon. The axon is the long, thin part of the neuron, which is where the signal travels to be relayed to the next neuron. So the signals travel down the axon and then they hop between the synaptic changes between the neurons. This myelin insulates the axon and increases the speed of transmission of the impulses between the neurons. Sensory and motor brain regions are fully myelinated after the first few years of life. However, axons in the frontal cortex continue the myelination process well into adolescence. So this is important because the speed of neural transmission in the frontal cortex is actually slower in our early adolescence compared to our later adolescence and young adults. So this is an area of development as well. So this also explains why some of that processing is limited when in fact the information travels at a different pace, more similar to a child. So as I mentioned, more recently, we have MRI or functional MRI studies that have provided a lot of new information about brain functioning, particularly in adolescence. So one of the most consistent findings from the more recent studies is that there is a steady increase in white matter in certain brain regions during childhood and adolescence. White matter is the tissue through which messages pass between the different areas of gray matter within the central nervous system. Myelin appears white in an MRI scan, and the increase in white matter is interpreted as reflecting increased axonal myelination, as was mentioned previously, in that frontal and parietal cortexes during adolescence. Most studies indicate that white matter increases linearly with age and has been interpreted as reflecting a continued myelination process that starts during very early childhood and really continues linearly into early adulthood. So the synaptic pruning, and this is one of the things I think is so interesting during adolescence and young adulthood, is the change that happens in terms of the synaptic density, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. So the synapses, which again are those connections between the neurons. So we have the information traveling down one neuron, connecting with the next and moving along. And as you can see at birth, there are a few connections. And then by really school age, if you will, young adult, or early childhood, the brain is absolutely chock full of these connections. And they're just extremely dense. And then what happens during adolescence and extends into early adulthood is this phenomenon of pruning. And basically what happens is the brain takes away and removes unnecessary synapses. And that really starts in early adolescence and continues into early adulthood. The idea behind that is it is essential for honing the functional networks of the brain tissue. So basically, that very early childhood brain has a lot of capacity, but the brain has to figure out what's actually needed, what's efficient, and what's not, what's sort of extra baggage, if you will. And so this really, by pruning the excess, sort of like you might prune weeds out of a garden, you're letting the functional neurons become more effective. These new strengthened and structured connections allow the brain to focus on a problem for a longer amount of time. So this pruning process literally leads to better concentration, and which is certainly explained if you compare a 5 or 6 year old to a 15-year-old. That ability to focus on one problem or issue for more than a few seconds to a minute is due to this pruning. It also provides the ability to carry out much more complex thought processes, which also makes sense if we think about the brain's development over those ages. The development of cognitive processes associated with the frontal lobes continues throughout adolescence and really into this early adulthood. Gray matter is mainly composed of cell bodies, dendrites, and axon terminals, and unmyelinated axons. The gray matter is a major component of the central nervous system and comprises the region of the brain which are involved in muscle control, sensory perception, such as seeing, hearing, memory, emotion, speech, decision-making, and self-control. The white matter, as I mentioned, is made up of myelinated axons, which really connect the regions of gray matter to each other. While the increase in white matter in certain brain regions seems to be linear across all brain areas, the changes in gray matter density appears to follow a more region-specific pattern. So while white matter development seems to be very steady and kind of just very continuous, slow and steady throughout this adolescent period, the gray matter development fluctuates and is more staged. So it might increase in one area at one age and then slow down and pop up in another area at another age and then slow down. In the frontal lobes, the decrease in gray matter density is very pronounced between adolescence and adulthood. Studies suggest that gray matter density development more or less coincides with the onset of puberty. At puberty, the gray matter volume in the frontal lobe is at its peak, followed by a decline throughout adolescence into early adulthood. This nonlinear decrease in gray matter in various brain regions throughout adolescence has been thought of in two ways. First, it is likely that axonal myelination results in an increase in white matter and a subsequent decrease in gray matter as those areas become myelinated and are no longer gray matter. So that could be one option. A second explanation is that the gray matter changes reflect the synaptic reorganization that occur at the onset and throughout puberty. The increase in gray matter apparent at the onset of puberty might reflect a wave of synaptic propagation at this time, at this life stage, and the increased white matter and decreased gray matter density throughout adolescence has been demonstrated in several studies. So though we don't know exactly the etiology, what is consistent is this changing in patterns of the amount of white and gray matter throughout adolescence. And the exact reason why it happens is probably less relevant than just appreciating the fact that the brain is continuing to evolve and change with age. The National Institutes of Mental Health in the late 1980s initiated a very large longitudinal study of normal brain development. And to date, has acquired data regarding brain development from over 2,000 children. Study subjects are and they receive MRI scans approximately every 2 years, including neuropsychological testing and genetic analysis. So this study has provided a lot of information about normal brain development that we understand today. Studies using this data have found that the peak brain size in females occurs at about 10 and a half years of age, while the peak occurs in males at about 14 and a half years of age. So females' brain size achieves maximal size earlier. 9 to 12% larger brain size has been reported in males than females. However, and I'm sure everyone on the phone already assumes this, that does not mean that there's any difference in functional capacity or cognitive ability. So brain size does not equate to brain capacity. So there's no reason to think that there's any difference between males and females in terms of cognitive achievement or capacity. The other areas often looked at are the hippocampus and amygdala. Our hippocampus controls emotion, memory, autonomic nervous system, and the amygdala is responsible for instinctual reactions such as fear or aggression. A larger size or more rapid growth of the hippocampus is typically reported in females and typically reported early, and the amygdala is larger and grows more rapidly in males. So a larger amygdala in males and a larger hippocampus in females are perhaps consistent with observations of greater density of androgen receptors in the amygdala versus higher estrogen receptors in the hippocampus. There's also data that shows the combination of steroid levels and brain volume seem to indicate more sensitivity of the amygdala to testosterone and likewise more sensitivity of the hippocampus to estrogen. These areas of the brain have been associated with disorders such as depression and anxiety, which, as you know, these are disorders which do show distinct differences between males and females, with females having a higher prevalence. So differences in brain development may provide some possibility that treatments may not have the same effect in males and females, which may be important to explore further and certainly an area of ongoing research. I think this is also important if we think about those treatments and therapies for an adolescent brain, which is under a lot of growth and development, and this is an area where it's really understudied. We know brain activity has shown different patterns of activation in the presence of equal cognitive performance. And this suggests that male and female brains may follow different paths to achieve the similar function. So to a male and a female presented with the same cognitive load, their brains may process that information differently, even if they end up with the same output. It's also well known that males and females differ in their emotional development throughout childhood and adolescence, but the timing, pattern, and the neurobiologic parallels of these differences remain poorly understood. There are studies to suggest that sex steroid receptors are distributed throughout the brain and influence neurodevelopment. Estrogen, androgen, and progesterone receptors are all found in the hypothalamus, consistent with its central role in the control of sexual and reproductive function, certainly. Areas that also have receptors are the amygdala, hippocampus, and cerebellum. All right, so let's move on. Now that we've talked a little bit about the actual neurodevelopment of the brain, let's talk about what that means for biologic, physical, and emotional development. So during adolescence, children develop the ability to understand abstract ideas, or we hope they understand abstract ideas. This occurs over time. And this could be anything from grasping a more complex math concept, developing moral philosophies, including really starting to understand the abstract notion of rights, privileges, what's right versus wrong, that sort of thing. Adolescents establish and maintain satisfying relationships and will develop over time the ability to share intimacy with less feelings of being worried or inhibited. They move towards a more mature sense of themselves and their purpose in the world, and question old values without losing their identity. And so, there's a lot of forming of individual identities during this time, obviously heavily influenced by the environment in which adolescents are raised. So if we look at physical development for females, and this is often what everyone equates so much with adolescence, is the physical development. So certainly young people go through many changes, early prepubescent onto secondary sexual characteristics. Females may begin to develop breast buds as early as 8, with full breast development usually between ages 10 to 18, though usually it's typically done by about age 15 to 16. Pubic, armpit, leg hair usually begin growth at 9 or 10 and then reach adult patterns by about 14 years. Menarche, which is the beginning of menstrual periods, typically starts 2 years after breast and pubic hair appears. The average age in the U.S. is 12 years of age for most girls, so there can be some variability by race, ethnicity, but the average age is 12. We know that females' growth spurt peaks around 11 and a half years of age and then slows down by age 16. So their growth, their height achievement is really during that early high school period, which is why in middle school, sort of late elementary school into early high school, girls are taller than boys, and then that rapidly changes. So for males, in the early adolescent development, testicle, scrotum, pubic and armpit hair growth, and growth spurt starts to peak. We know at 13 to 17 years of age is when the secondary sexual characteristics like testicular size, scrotum, and hair patterns will achieve adult stages. For some males, though, that doesn't happen until closer to 16, 17 years of age. This is also the time, typically around 13 to 15, where males start to have nocturnal emissions. And then certainly 18 years of age and older is when full maturation of genitals as well as other characteristics such as vocal cords and so forth have peaked. The peak height velocity for males occurs much later, so their peak height velocity is going to be closer to 15 to 17 years of age and extends longer than females. And this is really why males in general in the U.S. are taller than women, not only because their peak height happens later, but really they grow for a longer period of time compared to females. So the term executive function is used to describe the capacity to control and coordinate our thoughts and behaviors. And I feel like this is a term you hear a lot. It's used a lot in healthcare, but it's also used, it's kind of a common term thrown around in social media and so forth. And really it is an abstract term of how do we manage what's going through our brain and our behavior associated with that. These skills could include selective attention when appropriate, being able to focus attention on the item that needs your attention and ignore other distractions, our decision-making, our voluntary response inhibition, our working memory, our functional working memory. Executive functions have roles in cognitive control, for example, filtering out unimportant information, helping us plan for the future, and inhibiting inappropriate impulses. Different aspects of executive function have different developmental trajectories, and adolescents continue to develop these skills through their teen years. Teens exhibit improvement on tasks of selective attention, working memory, and problem solving, whereas strategic behavior appears to form earlier in childhood. So again, executive function is another area that takes time and develops over the course of adolescence, which absolutely makes sense. Most individuals do not reach full executive functioning capacity till early adulthood. As I mentioned, the functional MRI studies have been a way to learn more about our brain and the way our brain works in based on different exposures. So studies examining neural structures involved in the development of executive function of response inhibition. It was found that several regions of the frontal cortex were activated during a task that modeled executive function. This task required inhibiting a normal response and is known as a go, no-go. So subjects were told, for example, to press a button when they're shown any letter except for the letter X. So while doing this task, there was a significantly higher volume of prefrontal activation in children compared to adults. The larger widespread activity in the prefrontal cortex in children suggests that there's a heavier dependence on this region for executive function compared to adults. And during adolescence, the neural network used for this task is modified until adulthood, at which stage activation of a smaller, sort of more focal or more efficient region of the prefrontal cortex is used to perform the exact same task. While there was found to be no difference in accuracy on the task, which is interesting, so adults were no more accurate than children, their reaction times to successfully inhibit responses were improved with age. So they could react more accurately and really, if you think about it, use sort of less brain power to do those activities compared to a younger child. Reaction time combined with imaging data suggests that the excess synapses in the young brains of younger children really cause less efficient performance, if you will, particularly in that frontal cortex. And the more pruned and myelinated adult brain, which we went over, really could explain that faster reaction time and more of focal activation, where just a very focal region of a frontal cortex is used for the same activity. This go, no-go task is a great, very simple example of executive functioning that also includes working memory because you have to remember what the instructions were. As shown in the scans, extensive activation in children's brains may be a compensation because of the less efficient executive function. Prospective memory is our ability to hold in mind an intention and carry out that action at a future time. As this is associated with frontal lobe activity, this has also been shown to develop throughout childhood and adolescence, which, as we discussed earlier, is still, of course, developing in the adolescent brain. In addition to executive functions, the prefrontal cortex is also involved in several additional higher-level functioning processes, such as self-awareness and theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to understand others by attributing mental states to other people and recognizing that others have their own beliefs, desires, and intentions that are separate than ours. So it's really an appreciation of others as different than us and a respect for that difference. Social cognition development is a two-way process. In the same way it is affected by neural development and hormones, social cognition is also dependent on the social environment around us. What is seen as important socially is utilized in that synaptic pruning, and that's why, as we know for all of us, the environment in which we work, live, and play during childhood through adolescence is really influential on so many things, including our brain development. So perspective. Perspective seems like an abstract term, but it's really the ability to see all the information in a relationship and to see the viewpoint of another person. So being able to take another person's perspective into consideration is an essential part of creating relationships, successful communication, and we could really say successful adulthood. Being able to take another's perspective into consideration is related to first-order theory of mind because it involves conjecturing what another person is feeling or thinking and being able to perceive their body language and their words and extrapolating. Despite much debate, there's not an agreed-upon consensus about the mechanisms of underlying perspective taking. The simulation theory states that we are able to understand other people's perspectives by mentally simulating their thoughts, actions, and motivations in our own brain. This is supported by studies that show the same brain areas are activated when we perform an action and then see someone else doing the same action. The studies have shown that common brain areas are also activated when subjects perceive a visual scene or answer a conceptual question from their own perspective and from another person's perspective. Functional neuroimaging studies have revealed that parietal and frontal cortices are associated with making the distinction between first-person perspective and third-person perspective at the motor, visual, spatial, conceptual, and emotional levels. These studies suggest that the organization of motor, social, and affective knowledge is not distinct, but are intertwined with each other. Mirror neurons that fire when a person performs an action and also when a person observes another person performing a similar action provides a basis for integrating perceptual, motor, and social functions. In each of these contexts, superior frontal and right inferior parietal cortexes are activated to the greater extent during third-person perspective than during first. Several studies have identified the inferior parietal cortex and the distinction between self and others. We've talked extensively about the development of the frontal cortex earlier in the slides during adolescence. So it's no surprise that teenagers are still gaining the ability to think about themselves, think of others, and not just their own perspective. And so, though it sounds complicated when we get to all these different regions of the brain that control these things, but really the take home is this is why it is adolescence or teenage years are considered to be such a self-centric time in our development, because literally they are, and it does take time for individuals to develop that ability to appreciate the perspective of others, particularly their parents. Studies have shown the ability to recognize emotions based on facial expressions develops also during adolescence. It starts during childhood, but then really develops during adolescence. And in particular, recognition of fear and disgust shows the greatest improvements with age. There was no improvement in recognizing sad or angry expressions. In addition, pubertal status and not age affect emotional recognition. So it might be more the stage of puberty, less about the actual chronologic age. We know certainly younger children get very good at recognizing happy and sad, but it's the more nuanced facial expressions that take time for children to appreciate and perceive. Given that the processing of facial expressions is associated with prefrontal cortex, it is thought that the structural developments in the prefrontal cortex during adolescence and the concurrent change in the hormone environment affect the neural circuits involved in this particular emotion recognition patterns. There's been a number of studies that suggest hormone changes at puberty may directly impact cognitive performance. Alternately, it may be that adolescents' new form of self-awareness and their awareness of other people in response to their body changes at puberty may lead to recognizing facial representations. Again, it's unknown for sure. All that is known is that the nuances of appreciating someone else's emotional facial expression occurs over time. So one interpretation of all these findings is that in teens, the parts of the brain involved in emotional response are fully online or even more active than in adults, while the parts of the brain that restrain emotional impulsive responses are still developing. Such a changing balance might provide clues to the youthful appetite for novelty, the tendency to act on impulse without regard for risk. While much has been learned about the teen brain, it is not yet possible to know to what extent a particular behavior or ability is the result of a feature of the brain structure, change in the brain structure, hormones, and so forth. We also know many other things impact our brain, including our inborn traits, our genetic traits, personal history, culture, family exposure, and so forth. Imaging studies suggest the responses of teens to emotionally loaded images and situations are heightened relative to either younger children or adults. So teens, when shown a very emotionally charged situation or being, let's say, exposed to one with peers, they act much more, they have a much larger reaction, if you will, compared to a younger child or an adult. The brain changes underlying these patterns involve the brain centers and signaling molecules that are part of the reward system in our brain, which motivates behavior. These age-related changes shape how much different parts of the brain are activated in response to exposure to an experience, and in terms of behavior, the urgency and intensity of our reaction. So not just if we react, but how much we react to something. The enormous hormonal changes that take place during adolescence, of course, reproductive hormones shape not only our sex-related growth and behavior, but overall social behaviors. Hormone systems involved in the brain's response to stress are also changing during these years. As with our reproductive hormones, the stress hormones can have complex effects on the brain and subsequently complex effects on our behavior at that time. In terms of sheer intellectual power, the brain of an adolescent is a match for an adult. So this is why we have absolutely high functioning and high achieving adolescents, because the intellectual power is there. The capacity of a person to learn will never be greater than during adolescence. Isn't that depressing for all of us? The time has passed. But at the same time, behavioral tests, sometimes combined with functional imaging, suggest differences in how adolescents carry out their tasks or process that information they are learning. Adolescents and adults engage different parts of their brain to a different extent during tests requiring different cognitive functioning, such as maybe a calculation or something, in addition to impulse control or reaction to an emotional content. So the intellectual power and capacity is there, but it is often, I think of it as it's often shadowed by the less effective and less developed other aspects of the brain, including executive functioning and impulse control. All right, so how does this all translate into the behavior of our beloved adolescents? So in addition to the physical and neurologic changes that are happening during adolescence, there are certainly several behavioral and cognitive changes. Sensation seeking is one of the developmental contributors to risk behaviors and is more likely to emerge during adolescence than, of course, any other age. And really, I think it's important to take away that sensation seeking is a normal developmental stage. We obviously need to work hard to make sure it's a safe developmental stage, but that sensation seeking is normal. That is an absolutely normal part of this process. Adolescents are certainly notorious for engaging in risky behaviors, or we should say they're more likely to engage in risky behaviors than any other age group. This may be because of this drive to seek more reward and compensation for low recruitment of motivational brain circuitry, such as the right ventral strium or the right side of the amygdala. In a study investigating the neural differences between adolescents and adult decision-making processes, participants had to determine whether scenarios were a good idea or not a good idea. So pretty straightforward. Either it's good or it's not good. Adolescents were found to take significantly longer to determine a not good idea. It was proposed that when confronted with a risky scenario, adults were relatively efficient in responding because they were driven by the possible outcomes. So adults were able to jump to what are the possible negative outcomes of this scenario, as well as perhaps some visceral responses to the images, whereas adolescents instead relied more on reasoning capacities and activated different parts of their brain, which were still under development. So explaining more of an effort to respond compared to adults and subsequently a different outcome too, and what they perceived as not a good idea versus a good idea. Another study also examined how teens and adults would react to different situations. Although both groups responded similarly to questions, their brain activity differed. The medial prefrontal cortex was much more active in adults compared to teens. However, the teenagers had much more activity in the superior temporal sulcus of the brain, the area involved in predicting future actions based on previous ones. So some have thus believed that the teen's judgment is solely driven by the question, what would I do in this situation? Where an adult presented with the same situation would use what would I do given how I would feel and given how my actions would impact the people around me. So it's really that ability to have perceive others around you and how your actions might not only cause harm to yourself, but also to others. And whereas adolescents were not able to think in that capacity and were much more focused on what would this do to me. The changes in decision-making adolescents undergo, in addition to behavior, very sudden and rapid physical changes that they go through make adolescents very self-conscious, probably more so than at any other period during our life. They are sensitive, worried about their body changes, very self-conscious, and often make unnecessary comparisons about themselves with their peers, or even perhaps compare themselves to those around them or those that are in the media, movie stars, that sort of thing. Physical changes may not occur in a regular pattern. Therefore, adolescents, of course, they all go through awkward stages, and we all went through awkward stages, both in physical appearance and in coordination. So females may be anxious if they're not ready for beginning their menstrual periods. They start having their menses before they really are mature in other ways, which can be very anxiety-provoking for females as well. I mean, for the adolescent as well as for their family members. Males get very anxious or nervous or embarrassed about nocturnal emissions. So it is normal for adolescents to begin to separate from their parents and make their own identity. In some cases, this may occur without a problem from their parents or other family members. However, it often leads to some degree of conflict between the parents, of course, appropriately trying to maintain control and the adolescent trying to flex independence. And so I often think of this conflict as also a very appropriate and expected developmental stage of adolescence. Certainly our friends become much, much more important during adolescence as adolescents pull away from their parents and their family members really are in search of their own identity. And in early to mid-adolescence, their identity is very much shaped by their peer group. Friends become a safe haven. This allows adolescents to have a safe space, if you will, to test new ideas, take risks. Members of the friend group often they act alike, they dress alike, they have their secrets and so forth. So there's a lot of real bonding that occurs during these years. In early adolescence, the peer groups are often non-romantic, same-sex friendships. And as youth move into mid-adolescence, at sort of 14 years and up, the peer group expands to include romantic relationships as well. So let's talk a little bit about myths. And this is really myths in the mind of the adolescent. So myth number one, on stage. Basically that everyone's attention is focused on me, my appearance, my actions. It's this sort of self-centeredness of adolescence that we now can appreciate as really a brain development-driven sensation. How it seems to affect teens more than anyone else, of course, and some teens this can border on paranoia, narcissism, even hysteria. That everything's focused on them, and this is where, and myself as a parent, you often want to say, really nobody's paying attention, right? Or no, you're the only one noticing this. You're the only one worried about the pimple on your face, that sort of thing. But there is a very developmental self-centeredness that happens, which gives this perception of, oh my gosh, the world is looking at me and I'm on stage. The other very common myth is, well, of course it will never happen to me, right? This happens to everyone else, but never to me. And that it could be anything, right? That could be getting pregnant after sex, something, a car accident if driving under the influence, so on and so forth. That it could certainly be anything. But the notion that that invincibility that often goes with this age is also very normal developmental stage, and often one we worry about as parents and caregivers because of the potential risk-taking that could happen as a result. In mid to late adolescence, teens often feel the need to establish their sexual identity, and this is a normal part of transition into adulthood. They need to become comfortable within their own bodies and comfortable with their own sexual feelings. Adolescents learn to express and receive intimate or sexual advances over time, some more gracefully than others. Young people who do not have the chance for such experiences may have a harder time with intimate relationships when they are adults. So the notion of having the ability and hopefully to develop very safe and appropriately intimate relationships is good. And by intimate, we're not suggesting sexual activity, but just that ability to connect with someone that you're attracted to, whether that's of the same sex or of the opposite sex, depending on sexual orientation. That is probably a really good process during late adolescence and is formative for much, stronger adult relationships. Though adults drink more frequently than teens, when teens drink, they certainly drink larger quantities, and there's much more of this sort of binging and weekend warrior behavior. We also know that the adolescent brain responds to alcohol differently than the adult brain, which could explain some of the risk of binge drinking in youth. Drinking in youth and intense drinking are both risk factors, of course, for later alcohol dependence, but also really we worry about risk factors for poor decision-making in real time when alcohol is clouding what little functional status is available at the time for that adolescent. In addition to alcohol, some teens began to utilize different substances, marijuana being one of the most common recreational drugs. Drugs have been found to work in the brain through imitating the brain's natural chemical messages and overstimulating the reward circuit, which is, of course, the high. And what drives much of the addiction is that overstimulation of the reward circuit. Long-term effects of drug use amongst teens can lead to changes in the brain. So it doesn't just lead to poor behaviors or poor decision-making, but actually can physically change neuron development and brain circuits because that exposure is occurring at a time when the brain is actively trying to continue its maturation process. And so that's really important as we think about substance use, particularly marijuana use among our adolescents, as we can get permanent brain changes, particularly with excessive use. In general, when we talk about adolescent behaviors, teens often do act on impulse, misread or misinterpret social cues and emotions, unfortunately have accidents of all kinds. We hope they're generally minor. They are more likely to fight, risky behavior, and certainly sometimes dangerous behavior. Teens do not always think before acting, because they don't always have the full capacity to do so. They don't often pause to consider potential consequences or the consequences on others because of the self-centric time in their brain, and modify dangerous or inappropriate behaviors to be more safe. So they often can't think through the whole behavior process and possible outcomes. So points to remember is that an adolescent brain differences don't mean that young people cannot make good decisions or tell the difference between right and wrong. They need more help in doing so. So they have the capacity, but it's inefficient and it takes more time for them to get there compared to an adult. It also does not mean that they should not be held responsible for their actions, of course. I think this is an important time in life where we all learn that we have to be held responsible for our actions, even if we had poor decision making on the actions. And awareness of these differences can help medical providers to explain to parents, teachers, advocates, and so forth to better understand and manage behaviors of teenagers and really appreciate that some of these behaviors, though very challenging, are appropriate developmental stages. The tremendous neurobiologic, behavioral, emotional changes that take place in the adolescent and young adult brain, making it a time of risk, really also make it an incredible time of opportunity. And I love this part about adolescent resilience, because this is really, I think, the important part. And this is the positive, right? Resilience is the ability of an individual to function competently in the face of adversity or stress. Essentially, it means being able to bounce back from a difficult time, cope well with a challenge. In the context of mental health, resilience can also be viewed as the ability to handle stress positively. Resilience can be viewed as the product of the stressors an adolescent is currently bearing. Can also include the adolescent's temperament, their genetic temperament, his or her competence, both for independent and for seeking help when appropriate, and the social support provided by family members and others. There's been a lot of growing research on adolescent resilience, which have identified a number of characteristics that are associated with a resilient adolescent. And these characteristics include having at least one or more adolescents providing caring support. So basically having at least one adult that the adolescent can identify that cares for them. An appealing, sociable, and easygoing disposition. Now, this is not something we can often change. Dispositions challenge, but those that do have a more easygoing disposition tend to be more resilient. Good thinking skills. Intelligence as traditionally defined, but this also includes judgment and social skills. One or more talents that are a source for building confidence. Belief in oneself and the trust in one's abilities to make decisions. And then religiosity or spirituality has also been found to be associated with resilience. And again, this is often adapted from the family structure or the religion in which the youth is living. But just even having exposure to that, even if the youth doesn't express their own personal religious views, can be protective. Adolescents who are resilient may be better able to avoid risky behaviors, substance use, violence, and so forth. In addition, adolescents who participated in evidence-based resilience building programs, particularly those that did involve parents, showed a decrease in problems associated with anger and aggression, levels of perceived stress went down, and less susceptibility to peer pressure, less use of drugs and alcohol, all compared to adolescents who did not participate in such a program. Our adolescents may also find ways to reduce negative effects of stress on their lives and build resilience, such as getting exercise, and that's certainly good for all of us at all ages for resilience, avoiding substance abuse, and relaxation techniques. In addition, eating regular meals, avoiding excessive caffeine. I mean, let's be honest, this is good for all of us. Developing positive assertiveness skills, so how to politely but firmly say no and be confident in one's ability to say no or to say yes, depending on the circumstances. Learning to recognize or reduce negative self-talk, so not letting yourself believe that you are uglier than everyone, fatter than everyone, all these other very negative self-talk that adolescents have a lot of. Building a network of friends who also are a positive influence, of course, and then taking a break from stressful activities or situations. And I think this last one, though it might sound subtle, is really important. And I found too, taking a break from stressful activities or situations can be as simple as taking the phone away after a certain hour, because of the stress that can sometimes occur with trying to manage or keep up with social media, what your friends are saying, posting, etc., can be extremely stressful. Sometimes a break as simple as let's just put the phones away after 9 p.m. Can be extremely helpful. And though in theory an adolescent might express concern about being disconnected from their friends, what often happens is they have a great deal of relief from being disconnected. School or community-based programs can teach problem solving and social skills that can improve resilience as well. There's a number of formal programs that have been established to help adolescents develop these skills. Some target specific groups such as high risk or particular geographic locations. All right, so teen pregnancy. We're going to touch briefly about this as just a part of this important topic at this age. We know adolescent mothers have unique challenges and circumstances and certainly are at increased risk for medical, psychological, developmental, and other social problems. Developmentally immature adolescent mothers may put more time and energy into their relationships with partners than into their relationships with their new children, and have less knowledge about child development, of course, and less knowledge about appropriate parenting practices, which does increase the risk for child neglect and maltreatment in this group. Poverty, lack of education, and lack of a good support structure, whether that's family or friend support structure, contributes to a lack of adequate prenatal care, and which may be one component in the greater likelihood of negative health outcomes for adolescent mothers, particularly younger adolescent mothers, as well as their children. There is growing evidence that pregnant adolescents are at increased risk for domestic violence as well. Although pregnant adolescents have been shown to decrease their use of alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, and substances during pregnancy, the use of cigarettes and alcohol in particular has shown to increase steadily during the first 6 months postpartum. And what's important to know is when they resume substance use, whether it's cigarettes, alcohol, or other drugs, they do so much more rapidly after pregnancies completed than older adolescents and adults. Repeat births in adolescents have been linked to decreased educational achievement and also increased dependence on government support. It's also been linked with increased infant mortality and low birth weight. These negative outcomes result in an increased societal expense and can contribute to the continuation of the pregnancy cycle. A repeat or second pregnancy may occur in 35% of adolescent mothers within 2 years of birth, with 17% of those going on to deliver a second child in that time frame. So a repeat, what we call a repeat or a rapid repeat pregnancy, and a rapid repeat pregnancy is one that occurs within 18 months of the previous delivery, have been associated with a number of things, including not returning to school after the first pregnancy, living with a male partner, and receiving child care assistance from an adolescent mother. Although from the adolescent's mother, I should say. What I will say is having supportive adults and a supportive family is also protective for these mothers. So it's unclear what that role of the adolescent's family structure is, whether it's her mother or grandmother. There's certainly data to show that can be very protective if she has a strong support system, but it also has been linked to a rapid repeat pregnancy rate as well. Some adolescents report that their pregnancies are intentional. Certainly not all, but some do report that. So pregnancy prevention programs, as well as repeat pregnancy prevention programs, do need to focus on defining adolescents' goals, whether that's educational goals, motivations for pregnancy, and so forth, keeping in mind from the developmental perspective that these are still adolescents and their brain is still maturing. And so their ability to understand a desire for pregnancy may be inhibited. Previous studies have found factors associated with long-term success for adolescent mothers include, of course, completing school before becoming pregnant, which of course makes sense, right? Active participation in a program for pregnant adolescents, remaining in school throughout pregnancy and then completing after pregnancy, a sense of control over one's life, avoiding social isolation, and having one or two subsequent children later in life. A variety of family factors can also play a part in improved outcomes for teen moms. Early childcare for the infant of a very young adolescent mother provided by the infant's grandmother. Support that allows adolescent to finish school. Playful interaction between the infant and father, and stability of marital status if that's relevant. Presence of the infant's father on its own has not been shown to improve outcomes in all studies. But again, I think the jury's out here and there's a lot of work that needs to be done understanding the father's role for both the outcomes for mother and child. There are fewer adolescent fathers than adolescent mothers. Looking at all pregnancies in adolescent women, just 30 to 50% involve a father younger than the age 20 at the time of the child's birth. So as we know, many teenage girls have older partners, particularly those teenagers that end up pregnant. It's very common that their partner is older. Adult men who father a child with an adolescent girl tend to be more socioeconomically and psychologically similar to adolescent fathers than to adult men who father a child with an adult mother. So that's important. They're really functionally more adolescent than they are adult. Adolescent fathers are more likely to live in poverty, with adolescent fatherhood often repeated from one generation to the next, similar to motherhood. Social support by the father has been linked with increased risk for mother not to complete school, but partner support has been related to decreased depression and so forth among mothers as well. So again, I think this is an area that we just don't fully understand. I don't think anyone's going to assume that the father being involved is a negative for either the mother or the infant. Infants of adolescent mothers have increased incidence of low birth weight, prematurity, developmental disabilities, and poor developmental outcomes compared to those from older mothers. Children born to adolescent mothers are at risk for deficits in cognitive social development, which can persist into their own adolescent and young adulthood. One of the most important predictors of child development is the quality of the parent-child interaction, as it is at all ages. Parent-child relationships focused on interventions have been shown to moderate maternal behaviors and child developmental outcomes. So educating our younger mothers on improving their interaction styles and the way they play and interact with their infants and children may improve both their maternal responsiveness as well as the outcomes for their children. Home literacy environment certainly contributes to development of all children, and stressing the importance of literacy is less common among our younger mothers compared to older mothers. However, not providing literacy experience affects early brain development and later child development, including delay in oral language skills and reading skills. So as we wrap up here, when caring for adolescent mothers and their children, the AAP makes several specific recommendations. We have just highlighted a few here, including it's very important for all of us to provide continuity of care in a medical home for adolescent parents as well as for their children. Care for the parenting adolescent ideally would be multidisciplinary and would keep in mind that own adolescent mother's needs, not just that of her new infant. Promote breastfeeding, of course, like we do in all mothers. Contraceptive counseling and really family planning is critical at all ages, but certainly because of the risk of a rapid repeat pregnancy and the importance of completing education. Any interventions put into place need to account for the adolescent mother's developing brain function and the fact that she may not have full executive function at the time. Toxic stress, we know, has several negative effects on children and adolescents. Therefore, identifying children at risk is a priority for all of us. Many models of intervention and support for adolescent parents exist. These programs predominantly focus on the adolescent mothers and their children. There are specialized school-based programs that can provide multidisciplinary services to pregnant and parenting adolescents while keeping them in school. Any interventions put into place need to account for the adolescent mother's developing brain function and seek to enhance this brain function. The AAP and the Illinois chapter of the AAP are committed to mitigating the negative effects of toxic stress in children. Therefore, identifying children at risk for stress is certainly a priority for all of us. I know we came right up to the top of the hour. I want to thank you all so much for participating in what was a lot of information, but hopefully a helpful discussion about the adolescent brain development as it relates to their abilities and their behaviors. There are references for this talk are listed as well in the slides. Thank you so much.
So we just want to say thank you to everyone again for joining us for the webinar, and also just a reminder that I will be sending out the evaluation link following the webinar around possibly next week or so, if not earlier, and then also the recording will be available online so you can listen to it. And last, the slide deck will also be available online, and it is also in the handout section. Please be sure to join us for our next webinar in the series. It'll be on March 22nd from 12 to 1 on counseling providers and healthcare professionals on sex and sexuality conversations. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you again. Have a great day.